Hey everyone, thanks so much for coming today. I hope everyone's been seeing some really cool talks so far. In the next hour here, we're going to be talking about color management. I won't be going super in depth into every single aspect because it is quite a complicated topic, but instead, hopefully, I'll be giving you guys a broad bird's eye overview of kind of like the key stages that are really important with regards to color management for us as artists, especially as we move towards working for HDR wide color gamut displays. So my name is Anand Hotwani. I'm a technical artist working over at Ninja Theory, and I kind of specialize more in like photorealistic lighting, look development, shaders, and that kind of stuff. Okay, so let's start off with some goals first of what we might be wanting to achieve as artists trying to create really cinematic experiences. So the first goal typically may be to want to create photorealistic visuals on par with film visual effects to really kind of enhance and enrich the stories that we're trying to tell. And I think the second goal that goes really well with that is as like hardware, software, and all this kind of like elevates to a higher quality level, we should stop using the phrase, oh, that looks good for a game, because at that point we're kind of already making excuses, right? I think as technology and everything advances and our capabilities as an artist in real time improve, we really should be judging our games to a much higher quality. And this kind of ties into the third goal, which is where we kind of want to try simulate virtual worlds in our game engines like Unreal Engine. So typically, like concept art is still really, really important, right? We want to use that to establish tone and mood and atmosphere. But when we're creating our game art, we don't want to directly try and match the concept art because we want to prepare for HDR, we want to prepare for wide color gamut. We kind of have this intermediate stage between concept art and game art we are genuinely trying to create a realistic CGI world or CGI film set, if you prefer. And then we're trying to capture that dynamic range color gamut with our output display devices, which could be monitors, HDR TVs, anything in between. And probably the fourth and most important goal is that we really want to preserve our creative and rendering intent across all these multiple display devices, right? I mean, we might have people playing our games on HDR TVs, or they could be playing them in monitors on their offices, and anything in between, phones, tablets, whatever. We really want to make sure that the creative intent comes through across all these different display devices. Okay, so those are quite ambitious goals, and they all have very different problems associated with them. But luckily, a lot of this can be kind of like streamlined and achieved using a really strong color management system for our CGI pipelines. But color management doesn't just mean that the final output devices benefit, right? It means the entire digital imaging pipeline permeating all the way through. We as artists have much more control over what's going on with the color and the lights and all our text map values. So, for example, at the beginning, when we're doing camera footage, DSLR captures, material scanning, any reference footage that we take, if this all goes through a really good color management pipeline and we get a really good image ingestion pipeline, when we're using those for reference for texture maps, for look dev, we've got a really good starting point already. And kind of tied into that on the middle side of it is having really good calibrated look development environments. So these are environments which I'll touch upon later on in the presentation. But the idea is that we have locked camera and lighting values. The only thing we do is we put our digital assets into here to kind of really evaluate the BRDFs, the diffuse, specular, make sure everything is exactly where we want them to be for our physically based materials and shaders. And I'll go into more detail as to what scene-referred imagery is in a few slides, but the basic idea is all the way through the pipeline from the beginning until the end, we're working in the highest dynamic range possible, widest color gamut, keeping as much bit depth as possible, and it's only at the very, very end we kind of cut stuff down for our final display devices, right? So things like HDR, wide color gamut, they happen at the very beginning. They're not something we kind of bolt on at the very end. Okay, so I guess before I go any further, I'll kind of explain why this is becoming really important, especially nowadays. So display devices have changed a lot over the last 15, 20 years, right? I mean, we've gone from CRT to LCD, SD to HD, and now we're kind of going from standard dynamic range to high dynamic range. So you can see that obviously we had old monitors like that, and it's much more common now for consumers to be playing our games on much more high-end televisions capable of higher dynamic range and much more vivid colors. And another reason why this is important is because it actually reduces workload. It sounds like this is a lot of effort, right, to kind of get the boulder rolling. There's a lot of initial like heavy lifting. But once we actually have a really good color management pipeline, this ends up actually reducing our workload because we can reuse assets, we can reuse texture maps because they've been stored in wide color gamut. They're HDR ready from the beginning. We can start to reuse materials, textures for all sorts of different projects, assuming we want photorealism. And again, we're not having to like branch lighting scenarios. We're not having to do wide color gamut versions of textures because this kind of permeates all the way through a single unified pipeline. We're kind of getting everything there, and we're prepared if maybe like a client comes to us later on being like, oh, we want you to do an HDR remaster. That's okay because we've kind of been working in this dynamic range all along, and we're kind of prepared for that. And I kind of touched on this already, but it again really helps with us trying to make physically based shaders, physically based rendering. It's great that artists are now really familiar with making proper albedo maps, proper roughness and specular maps. But physically based materials also expect physically based light values, physically based color values to really maximize it. So in short, having a really good color management system means that we just get more out of our physically based materials. And yeah, I think that's how we kind of evolve and get up there with more film VFX kind of imagery. Okay, so I've gone through kind of like an introduction as to what this will involve, what kind of like steps and why. I'm going to spend a bit of time going through some color science overview. Again, it's not going to be super technical. It is quite a long section, but hopefully it'll give you guys a good rough idea of the key areas that are important in color science. Okay, so what is color science? Color science can be described as a blend of physical measurement and characterizations of the human visual system. So for us as artists, what this means is when we're working in our digital displays, RGB color spaces, every way that that's designed is kind of underpinned by the science behind color and light. And I really don't think it's just for programmers and engineers to be familiar with, right? I think having a good technical underpinning really informs the creative side of what we do too. I kind of like see it like a sculptor learning anatomy, and it really does inform when they're doing their more creative side of stuff, having that technical underpinning. So light and color, what we all see with our eyes right now, is part of the electromagnetic spectrum. This is light measured by its wavelength, and the electromagnetic spectrum is huge, right? It covers radio waves, gamma waves, X waves, gamma, ultraviolet. But visible light, the light that we see here, red, greens, and blues, that's only a tiny part of the electromagnetic spectrum. This is between about 380 to 780 nanometers. And typically, remember, this is kind of like continuous wavelength data, right? But we're able to distinguish between red, greens, and blues because they have different wavelengths. So red tends to be longer, green tends to be medium wavelengths, and shorter wavelengths end up looking more blue. But why? Why do we kind of have these three main primary colors? And how do we go from this continuous wavelength into distinct RGB values? Well, as it happens, humans, we have trichromatic vision, which means we kind of have three color receptors, which again are sensitive to long, medium, and short wavelengths, which is where we kind of get these primary ideas of spectral to RGB from. This is actually not common for a lot of mammals, right? Most mammals only really have two color receptors, so they can see between reds and blues, but they can't differentiate the greens. And you can see in this kind of example over here what that might potentially look like. But yeah, so the basic idea is that humans have three different types of color receptors, which is why we distinguish between red, green, and blue. But having this continuous spectral data isn't super useful, right? When we're working in RGB displays, RGB color models. So let's talk about how we go from spectral data to an sRGB color space, for example. The CIE, which is the International Committee of Illumination, did a whole bunch of color matching functions, a whole bunch of lab experiments, and they ended up with this formula where we can actually take this continuous spectral data and convert it into three main variables, capital X, Y, and Z. But X, Y, and Z in itself doesn't directly relate to RGB. It's more just useful for differentiating between different spectral power distributions. So as artists, the XYZ color space isn't really very useful to us, but we can use it as a really good interchange color space. And what we can do is we can normalize the X, Y, and Z components to put it into, and we can plot them onto a graph into X, Y, Y space, which gives us the spectral locus, which I'm sure all of us are very familiar with, right? So this diagram demonstrates all the reds, all the greens, all the blues, everything in between that we as humans are capable of perceiving in visible light. Okay, so we've gone from continuous spectral data to XYZ, and now to the spectral locus. And now to turn it into an RGB color space, it's actually really simple. All we do is we pick a point to represent red, one for green, one for blue, and then where we want our white point to be specified. And whatever is bound by this triangle is now our RGB color space. So this is the color space probably we're all most familiar with. This is sRGB. This is the color space that's been standard for internet, TV, all that for the past 15, 20 years. And it has a good coverage, but remember I said a few slides ago that the spectral locus represents all the possible colors we can see, right? And you can see that the sRGB color space doesn't cover anywhere near all of it. You can see there's still a huge amount missing between all these greens and reds and blues and purples. So that means if, for example, on sRGB color space, if we put a value of 100, which is the most reddest red we can do, it's not the most red that we can perceive as humans. There's still even more reds we can perceive. So when I say the idea of wide color gamut, essentially all that really means is our display devices have a bigger triangle. So this is the DCI P3 color space, which is kind of the standard color space used in digital cinema. So if you ever go into the movies and you think, oh wow, those colors look much more vivid, much richer, this is why. It's because they're mastering to a wider color gamut, so you're getting more coverage in your greens and in your reds. And it's a really good color space to encompass pointers gamut, which I'll cover again in a few slides. But yeah, I think DCI P3, or at least the P3 primaries, are going to be the main color space that we as artists will be authoring in over the next few years. So even though we all have sRGB monitors right now, I think it'll become more and more common for texture artists, lighting artists, environment artists to all kind of switch to DCI P3 monitors to kind of get that extra coverage of reds and greens and blues. And the other RGB color space I really want to touch on is the Rec 2020 color space. So if you've kind of experimented with HDR televisions, you're probably familiar with Rec 2020 being the main color space supported. But actually, no devices are able to fully represent 100% of Rec 2020, right? It ends up being used more as a container space to kind of encompass sRGB and DCI P3. For example, like Amazon Prime and Netflix, if you're delivering HDR content, they normally ask for it to be mastered and finaled in DCI P3, but then delivered in a Rec 2020 container. But because it's a very, very wide gamut color space, it also ends up being really good for rendering. And I'll explain why in a couple of slides too. So yeah, going back to what pointers gamut is, this is different from the other color spaces, right? It's not just an RGB color model. It actually ends up being many, many samples of real life objects and their color values. So someone's gone off, they've got with a spectroradiometer, they've kind of measured everything in nature and figured out roughly where they lay, plotted on the graph. So yeah, all the natural colors that appear in the real world are encompassed by this gamut. So for example, let's say we're doing a project in wide color gamut and we want to get the grass and the trees and the foliage. Ideally, we want to make sure that all the greens and the yellows stay within pointers gamut. Otherwise, we're going to end up with reds and greens, which feel a bit unnatural and fake, and we won't be entirely sure why. And again, this kind of goes back to why I think it's really important for artists to have some technical understanding of color science. Okay, so color spaces also become really beneficial, not only for HDR TVs, but also for rendering. So it's been proven that using a wider color gamut is really, really important, not only to author for HDR displays, but also it tends to end up in better color representation too. The general idea is that the wider the color gamut, when we're rendering, we tend to converge closer to spectral rendering, which we can kind of think of as ground truth sort of rendering. So to illustrate this a bit more, here's a test done by Anders Langlands. What he's done is he's just taken these boxes of Macbeth charts, he's lit it with a white light, and he's done it spectrally between 380 to 700 nanometers in its wavelength, which again you can think of as what the ground truth of this really would be. And he's done the same thing in an sRGB color space. You can see like it's very, very subtle, right? But there is some kind of color difference going on there. And just to illustrate that a bit more, I've done a difference operation, multiplied it by 2. It's not huge, but when we get into this level of photorealism and really wanting to get accurate color representation, this kind of stuff does start becoming really important. Okay, so that kind of covers everything I wanted to talk about with RGB color spaces. But probably another thing we've come across in like texturing packages or software packages is the idea of linear to sRGB and something to do with the gamma correction, right? But what's going on here? Like I just explained how we go from spectral data to an RGB color space, but I never mentioned anything about linear or sRGB or gamma. So I'll spend a few slides now just kind of explaining so we can figure out exactly what this means in relation to sRGB color spaces. So the reason we have this kind of gamma correction, the linear sRGB kind of stuff, is because digital cameras, digital display devices react to light differently to us. They can kind of count photons linearly, whereas we as humans, we kind of perceive light with kind of like a non-linear curve, which essentially means like midtones tend to be a bit more raised. And when we're doing our texturing, this is why we end up making sure we linearize stuff, because even though it looks correct to us, for the renderer, it needs to be mathematically linear. So here's just another illustration of that. You can see on the left is an image that's been rendered linearly without any gamma correction. And on the right, we've applied the gamma correction to just make it feel a bit more natural to what we'd expect. And again, if people are familiar with photography, they're probably familiar with the idea of 18% gray being mid-gray, right? But I mean, if you stop and think about that, it doesn't really make sense, right? Like if it's mid-gray, why is it not 50%? But again, because we have this kind of like non-linear reaction to light, what is 18% ends up being perceived more like 50%. So again, same thing here. We've got 18% gray, completely linear, without any gamma correction. And on the right, we've got 18% gray with the gamma correction to kind of simulate how we would like react to 18% gray. So yeah, this idea of gamma correction, keeping linear and having a linear workflow is really important, because if 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2, then all our rendering algorithms aren't going to come up with desirable results. So for the light transport, and especially now that we're getting more into ray tracing, it becomes really, really important that we have a linear workflow for our PBR calculations. But then, once we've kind of rendered everything linearly, we kind of want to apply this gamma curve at the end as kind of like a pair of sunglasses, so we can kind of like view it how we'd expect to, right? And what this is called, to be more specific, is an electro-optical transfer function. And there's one specifically for the sRGB color space, which is why there's always this confusion between sRGB and gamma and the color space. So yeah, if we want to be more specific, when we say linear to sRGB, we could say linear to display for an sRGB device using a gamma correction. But if we want to be even more specific, we can say linear to display for an sRGB device using an sRGB electro-optical transfer function. But that doesn't roll off the tongue quite as easily as linear to sRGB, which is why typically in software and all that stuff, we just tend to see kind of it concatenated to linear to sRGB. But just kind of know when you do encounter that, typically it's not talking about the color space, it's not talking about the color gamut, it is talking specifically about gamma correction. Okay, so we've kind of covered RGB color spaces, we've covered the idea of linear to gamma. Another thing that I really want to talk about with regards to color space and color science is how digital images and color spaces can have different imaging states. So there's two main ones that we as artists really need to be concerned with. The first one is display referred imagery, which relates to display devices, and the other one is scene referred, which refers to some kind of input scene that could be real life, or it could be a CGI rendered scene that we come up with. So display referred is kind of like the first one and the one that we're probably all really familiar with, right? So this is between a 0 to 1 range because it's representing the pixels coming out of the screen. So if you've got a pixel of 0, it's kind of telling the computer, put like nothing into this pixel, right? I want it to be completely turned off. But if you have a value of 1, it means I want this pixel to be completely on, which is cool. So we've got this kind of like 0 to 1 range, and typically we use 8-bit images like PNGs or JPEGs to illustrate this. But there's a limitation to it, right? Already the 8-bit is an issue with HDR devices. When we have kind of 10-bit output devices, we'll start ending up with banding artifacts because we've only got 8 bits when we've got a 10-bit display. And the other big issue, especially with physically based rendering, is that display referred imagery has a really limited dynamic range. So for example, if we went outdoors, we took a photo of the sun with a camera phone, and then we did the same thing in here, we took a photo maybe of that light or that light. If we take both these images and kind of pixel sample them in Photoshop, we'd maybe see the sun being a value of 111. We'd see maybe the light being a value of 111. But intuitively, we know that the sun and the light in the room aren't of the same brightness value, right? The sun is many, many, many times brighter. And this is a limitation of display referred imagery. We can only kind of have values between 0 to 1. If we have things that are much, much brighter, can't really differentiate between them. This is where scene referred imagery becomes really, really important. So scene referred imagery, again, is linear values representing pixel luminance, but this time it's in the range 0 to whatever, right? It could be 100, 1,000, a million. Doesn't really matter as long as it kind of fits within the floating point range. So a scene, this time we're not relating to a display device, we're relating to, again, maybe like a real life film set, or maybe our fully rendered CGI worlds that we go off and make. And because these have a much greater dynamic range, we typically use 16-bit, 32-bit render buffers or files to save them in as EXRs or HDR files. And this is great because going back to the example of the sun and the light in the room, we can now have this dynamic range represent in scene referred imagery, right? So the light there could be a value of 30, the sun could be a value of 200,000. We've kind of got this dynamic range going on under the hood, which is great. But again, we need to display these on display devices, which are 0 to 1. So when we're working with scene referred, we need to do some kind of tone mapping operation to kind of cut this down and see it in a sensible way. Okay, so that was quite wordy. I'll go through some visual examples now to hopefully illustrate this a bit better. So on the left, we've got a display referred image, and the maximum value we've got of the light is 111. Everything beyond that has been clamped to a value of 1. And on the right, we've got the same image, but this time I've captured it in multiple exposure brackets, combined it together into an EXR, and we end up with a scene referred image. So we have values beyond 0 to 1. So the light up there has a value of about 63. So now if we pull the exposure down on them, you can see because the display referred image only has a 0 to 1 range, all we're doing is sliding that clamped value down. But when we have it in scene referred and we have values beyond 0 to 1, we actually end up with a much better looking image. And if we went off and we actually captured this with a low exposure, it would probably end up looking more like that than it does that, right? Okay, and not only is that important for the images that we make, but also now that we're with ray tracing and area lighting, and we want to use texture maps for our area lighting, this becomes really important, especially with image-based lighting, in making sure we have good scene-referred imagery for our texture maps. So here's an example of an HDRI that I've used to light a scene. You can see in the chrome balls, the specular response looks exactly the same. You can see the exact same environment, but because of the different clamping values, it really does affect the GI and the specular and the diffuse response. So this becomes really, really important, right? Like if we're not working in good scene-referred dynamic range, it can really throw off how we perceive and author our materials and shaders, because if everything is in the 0 to 1 range, we're gonna author biases into it, and then once we display it to an HDR device, because we've not got that dynamic range, everything's gonna look really dull and washed out. Okay, yeah. So again, why this is important, physically based rendering is going to expect scene referred values for the specular, diffuse, and global illumination. But not only that, post-processing effects like Z defocus, motion blur, they all expect scene referred values to carry out their calculations properly. And again, if we make sure that we tone map all this properly, we just out of the box tend to get better looking standard dynamic range imagery. But again, because we're working in scene referred, we're also protecting ourselves for when we want to go off and do HDR versions. And another thing that's really important working with scene referred imagery is making sure that we use 16, 32-bit floating point images for archival. If we kind of master all our texture maps to 8-bit PNGs or JPEGs, we're not going to have the kind of like bit depth that we really need to look good on HDR devices. And yeah, like it's really important to remember that standard dynamic range can have certain levels of black and white, and HDR devices can have even more. So we want to make sure we actually have rendering information on both ends of the spectrum. Yeah, so I spoke about tone mapping earlier. I'll just kind of cover that a bit more to talk about how we go from scene referred imagery and kind of like put it into a 0 to 1 range that we can work with. The basic principle is that we want to render everything linearly without any gamma corrections. And then once we're happy with our rendered images, we want to display it. We use a viewing operation, a display transform, where we kind of typically put stuff into a log space and kind of cram as much information into 0 to 1 as possible. But the thing is, it'll look very low contrast. And what we do to compensate for that is we apply an S-curve to add a bit more contrast back into it. So going back to the linear to sRGB example, this is great because now the midtones look a lot more natural, but you can see in the highlights, everything is completely clipped out, right? Because we've not done anything to kind of handle values greater than 1. But if we now apply kind of like a tone mapping operation over the top of it, put everything into a log space, everything looks a bit washed out, that's fine. Then we apply an S-curve to it to kind of make it seem a bit more natural and more contrast that we see in real life. Suddenly we get a lot more representation in our highlights. And you can see like the example here is huge, right? Like you're getting much more useful color values beyond 111 that you wouldn't get if we weren't doing some kind of tone mapping operation over the top. Because remember, we want this dynamic range going on under the hood, but to actually display for our low dynamic range displays, we need some kind of tone mapping to kind of represent this dynamic range onto our smaller dynamic range displays. Okay, so I appreciate that was quite a long topic. That was kind of color science in a nutshell, and that's kind of all the stuff that I think is really important for us as artists to be familiar with. So just to recap, the idea of visible light, remember it's measured by its wavelength. We go from the spectral data to 3 values, X, Y, and Z, and then we plot that into the spectral locus. From there, we can make sRGB, DCI-P3, and the other color space. The other thing that was really important was this idea of linear to sRGB referring to gamma correction and not confusing that with the sRGB color space. And the other thing that I touched on was display referred and scene referred imagery. There are 2 different imaging states that I think is really useful for us as artists to be familiar with. Okay, so now what I'll move on to is kind of talking about what a color management pipeline could look like. This isn't the only way that we can do it. I'll run through an example, and if it sticks with you, go for it. If you think you've got better ways for color management, then that's great too, because there's more than one solution to all of this. But we have identified some problems working for HDR wide color gamut, right? We've got several RGB color spaces we need to worry about. We don't have just sRGB anymore. We've got DCI-P3, Rec 2020. We also need to be prepared for whatever happens in the future. We also need to make sure that we differentiate between linear gamma corrected, the correct order-off operation. And we also need to make sure that we're differentiating between display referred, scene referred imagery. So one solution that we can use is the ACES workflow, which I'm sure some people are familiar with. This is the Academy color encoding system. It's kind of like the system being used in motion picture and post-production to kind of manage digital imagery all the way through, from the DP shooting it all the way until post-production, color grading, and final delivery and archival. So it's really good because it supports HDR, wide color gamut, out of the box, because the film industry is really concerned with that too. And because it's been proven on so many motion picture films, we know it's production ready. We know it works with digital imagery, and they're kind of like having the same problems that we have now with HDR, wide color gamut. There's no reason why we can't adopt an ASUS workflow to work for our game systems. So broadly speaking, the ASUS workflow is we kind of go from something which could be any color space, transform that into the ASUS color space with an input device transform. Once we're in the ASUS color space, we could use an ultra-wide gamut one called ASUS 2065-1, which is kind of like a massive, massive color space that uses imaginary colors to make sure that we encompass all of the spectral locus. Remember that kind of horseshoe-shaped diagram is a color space that makes sure it encompasses everything we see there. Or we could be using a better, more suitable working color space for our CGI, which could be the ASUS CG color space, which is slightly bigger than Rec 2020, which means we kind of encapsulate all the main color spaces we might be working with as artists. Once we've kind of gone through this ASUS workflow and everything's in linear space, this is when we can display it. So we apply like the RRT, which is, remember the S-curve that we had earlier for tone mapping? This is kind of like the standardized Academy S-curve. So we can apply that as a standard used across all these different distribution software. And that's kind of like, we've kind of got everything in a color space that represents infinite dynamic range, ultra wide gamut, ultimate bit depth. But then we need to display this to a device, right? So that could be an HDR display, it could be a monitor. That's what the ODT, which is the output device transform, handles. This kind of like cuts everything down. So we kind of display our images on a useful output display device. So ASUS is great because it kind of covers this issue that we have of many color spaces, right? When we acquire our images, reference images, HDRs, everything that we capture from a camera, we can debayer it directly from RAW to an ASUS color space. And then we've kind of got that high dynamic range preserved. Rather than going from RAW to sRGB, we're now making sure we're doing an ultra wide gamut. So we've got all the reds, greens, and blues that we might need in an ultra wide gamut. When we're rendering our images, remember how I said that having a wider color gamut can help at color representation? Well, using a wide gamut ASUS color space means that it helps us with this color representation too. And again, when we want to tone map and display for an sRGB device or an HDR device, the ASUS Light system already has its own display transforms. We don't have to go off and do a whole bunch of R&D and dev time to coming up with display transforms. They already exist. They're all on GitHub. You can go through the code line by line by line, figure out exactly what you need to for implementation. And again, ASUS works really well for scene-referred imagery. Remember that we want to make sure that we're rendering in this high dynamic range, and the default linear to sRGB transform doesn't handle values beyond 111, so everything ends up clipping. That's okay, because ASUS kind of understands that, and it makes sure it has standardized tone mapping operations for what we're concerned with. So I'll do a visual example of this now. What you can see on the left and right, they're essentially the exact same rendered image in linear, right? The only difference between them is how we're using the display transform. So let's assume for the sake of this example that the look dev environment is completely calibrated. The boot is like perfectly shaded, and look dev, the texture maps are all correctly set. And the only difference is how we're actually displaying this. You can see on the ASUS one, it kind of keeps everything in a 0 to 1 range really quite well. But on the sRGB one, where we're not handling values out of 1, things look a bit like washed out. The midtones feel a bit overemphasized. And typically as an artist, maybe we'd look at the sRGB image and we go, oh no, the lights are too bright, let's pull that down. And then they'll go, oh, maybe the texture map is too bright, let's pull that down even more. But actually all you're doing is you're taking this scene referred value and you're kind of like crushing everything into a 0 to 1 range, right? So even though it's going to look great on your monitor, when you try to display that to an HDR device, you're not going to have that dynamic range that we need. Whereas if we're using the ACES transform, because we've got a standardized tone mapping operation, it's handling values beyond 0 to 1, and we just kind of get a much better image out of it. You can see on the sRGB one, we're kind of getting clipping artifacts already, but on the ASUS one, everything there is kind of staying in the good 0 to 1 range already. We're not having to change the lighting, we're not having to change the texture maps, everything just kind of fits really well. If we pull the exposure up one stop, you can see the difference between them. The ASUS one on the left is kind of handling everything in the 0 to 1 range quite well. Still, it's brighter, but again, it's still handling the values all right. But on the sRGB one, because we're pushing even more values beyond 1, things are starting to look not so great. We're seeing again on the brick wall, all of that starting to clip, whereas on the ASUS one, it's still not as bright and it's still handling it really quite well. If we pull the exposure up another stop, you can see now on the boot, we're starting to get clipping artifacts on the sRGB one, especially on the highlight here. We're kind of like losing all that detail, right? But on the ASUS one, we're still keeping that all within the 0 to 1 range really quite well. So we're able to display this dynamic range really successfully. If we pull the exposure up one stop, I don't think either of these are winning anymore, right? They're both pretty washed out and not great. But again, you can see on the boot, even though all of this is kind of like pretty horribly clipped on the ASUS one, like we're starting to lose detail, but it's still not really, really looking too harsh. Oh, and another thing is if you have a look at kind of like the greens going on here, we're getting some really weird color shifting going on. But the ASUS one, again, is still maintaining the greens and the yellows to a good level. Okay, so we've kind of gone through a whole bunch of really important stuff with how we go off and create and render our CGI, right? But that's only part of it. The way that we actually see it and display it is really important too. So the idea is that if we review maybe dailies or game content in a really well-lit office environment, we're going to perceive it very, very differently if we look at the exact same images in maybe, for example, a really well-lit, dark color grading room. The exact same image is going to look really quite different with how we perceive the contrast and highlights. This is the Bartolson-Brenneman effect. So the idea is that you can see all these tonal patches horizontally. They are the same value, but because of the kind of like background that we're perceiving them on, they look different. The contrast looks washed out on this side, and it looks better on the black there, and the highlights similarly look very different. So we can't really trust our eyes all the time, right? We need to kind of reduce as many variables as possible. And yeah, like related to that, if you've ever kind of like authored stuff on the monitor, put it onto a TV afterwards and realize it looks very crunchy and contrasty, the reason is because TVs expect us to be in a darker surround environment, so they use a stronger gamma function. So it ends up looking more like that to kind of like compensate and make sure that the contrast looks a bit better. So yeah, if you've ever kind of come across that and never really known why, that's usually why. And not only is kind of like the viewing environments really, really important for us too, we also want to make sure that we calibrate our monitors really as best as possible too. For example, let's say an art lead goes over to an artist and says, oh, this looks too red, I need you to change it. But then the artist replies going, no, the red looks completely fine on my monitor. Well, if neither of the artists have calibrated their monitors, well, how do you know which one is correct, right? There's just no way of resolving that at all. But if we go off, we kind of like calibrate all our monitors, make sure the color spaces are set up properly. If we make sure the brightness levels are set properly too, it means that we perceive saturation and contrast the same way too. Hopefully we kind of like reduce the standard deviation between all this, and we never come up with that situation about red being too red on one person's but not the others. Again, it won't work 100% of the time, and that's why having review environments with really good controlled ambient lighting can be really, really important, especially when we're trying to do more photorealistic imagery. Okay, so that's part 2 covered. We've kind of gone through color science, we've kind of gone through all that technical side of it, and now we've kind of like had a look at how a color management pipeline could potentially look like via the ACES workflow, which again is really good for preserving all this dynamic range and all the color values that are outside of an sRGB color gamut. The important thing here, again, is that it's a unified pipeline, right? Like I never said that this is for SDR, then we do this for HDR. Everything is being rendered and run through the exact same unified pipelines. So we're not having to like branch content anymore. It can all kind of fit with all this dynamic range and everything being preserved really well. Again, this is why scene referred becomes really, really important for us as artists. And finally, even though we're putting a lot of effort into how we render and make sure everything is linear, how we actually view it, the monitor calibration and the viewing conditions are really, really important for us too. Okay, so obviously this is quite a lot of new kind of like ideas that I've shared with you guys. And I just kind of want to do a working example to kind of illustrate how we maybe go from start to finish with this kind of stuff. So hopefully you leave today with a better idea of how this could work day to day for us as artists. Okay, so let's say we want to do a digital double of this mannequin and jeans. Maybe not the most interesting asset, but I think it will illustrate what we need to really quite well. First thing we want to do is we want to capture a look development environment. So this could be anywhere with really good reproducible lighting that we can go in at any time and we can kind of capture what we need to. Matt Stanham will be doing a talk on this later this afternoon. So if you're interested in the look dev stage of it, I really recommend going to that. I'll just very briefly cover what this kind of illustrates on this slide though. So we use the chrome ball at the left to kind of like capture the lighting environment, to really kind of like capture the orientation of the HDRI. We use the gray ball to capture the ambient lighting environment, figure out roughly where the primary light is coming from, and then we can kind of set the exposure and everything based off of that. And the color checker is really, really important too, because this, again, going into this idea of color management, we want to neutralize any accidental color cast, we want to white balance and mix, we really normalize how we ingest all our images. Remember, the image ingestion pipeline is really important to make sure our reference HDRIs are all really well authored from the beginning. So we go in, we capture a bracketed dynamic range, again, to get scene referred values. So we put it on different exposure stops, and we kind of capture the exact same image multiple times, and then combine that into a scene referred EXR or HDR file. So yeah, that kind of ends us up with this HDRI panorama of a room. We've got, again, because we've captured all the different bracketed exposures, we've got good scene referred dynamic range values coming out of it. But again, remember I mentioned about the color checker. That's why that's hiding over there in that corner there. It's really important because sometimes the white balance and the way that the camera and all the HDR like joining up together algorithms work, sometimes we can lose saturation and color values in ways that we might not expect. So this is what it looks like when we color neutralize it, right? Like it's not huge, but like it really does make a big difference when we're getting to this level of photorealism where we really want to normalize all the images that we ingest. So it's not massive, but I really think this is a really important stage for when we're capturing reference textures and look dev environments. So yeah, once we've got this HDRI and we've captured it with a good dynamic range, we can go off, we can calibrate our CGI Light Rig. So like we had in real life, chrome ball, gray ball, we can model those in CGI, which this is why we pick spheres, right? Generally, most artists are able to model spheres, so it doesn't take too long to set up. Or we put an 18% gray card into the scene, an 18% gray material, we put a kind of like metallic material. And again, because we've captured the really good dynamic range, we've gone through a good linear workflow, we're using the ACES tone mapping operation for our reference images. We're doing the exact same thing with our CGI in Unreal Engine, right? Like we're again rendering it scene referred, rendering it in a good color space, and then we apply the ACES tone mapper at the end. And at this stage, because we've gone through a really good color management system, because we've neutralized the colors, it makes it actually really quite intuitive and quite quick to get the CGI reference balls really similar to the ground truth reference that we've captured. And yeah, once we've done that, once we've got a really good look dev environment, we can kind of lock that off, right? We lock off the camera and the lighting intensities, we don't change that at all because it's calibrated. There's nothing left to do. So we can leave that as it is, and we can use that for a whole bunch of assets. In this case, again, we're using the Mannequin and Zines. We go off, we capture this bracketed dynamic range, we kind of combine it together into an EXR file. And yeah, because we go through the ACES workflow, we end up with a really good reference image with a good dynamic range applied to it. Then we go off and do what we typically would do. We'd go off modeling, texturing, UVs, all that stuff. And then once we kind of set up the materials in UE4, this is when it becomes really, really important to have our ground truth reference, because now it just kind of becomes a very technical game of spot the difference, getting your CGI to match the reference as best as possible. Not only is it really important to do it in your calibrated environment that we've captured, but I think it's also really good to run it through a whole bunch of different look dev environments that we go off and capture, because we really want to make sure we want everything to be photorealistic. We don't want to accidentally author biases into it for that one specific environment. So I find it's really useful to have one very like ambient overcast environment, one with like smaller point lights to really stress test and make sure we've not accidentally put some issues, like we've compensated for roughness when actually we maybe sort of bumped up the diffuse, all those little things there that could really affect the photorealism. I find sanity checking it through a bunch of look dev environments really, really benefits. And yeah, once we've done that, again, we take it through a really good color calibrated room, really good lighting environment, and we can review it. And then once we're happy that our digital double matches our CGI our reference as best as possible, we can review it, final it, all done. And next time, let's say we want to do a denim material, we've already got one that we know has gone through a really good color management pipeline. We can start from there. We don't have to start from scratch every time. And this goes back to another reason at the start where I said this reduces workload, because the more and more we do this, the more and more assets we pump through a really good color management pipeline, the more and more of a library of assets that we can build up, right? And because they're ready for HDR, they're ready for wide color gamma, we don't need to go off and keep on reauthoring them every single time we need to do a new remaster for our games. Okay, so I'll wrap up now. Hopefully I've convinced you guys that color management is really important for us going forward for HDR and wide color gamma, and hopefully you take that away with you guys today. A second point is, again, the idea of concept art to game art. We want this kind of intermediate stage where we really are trying to create simulated CGI worlds and kind of capturing that with our CGI cameras, which go off and become like our output display devices, TVs, HDR monitors, etc. And the final point is, I think it's really important that we work non-destructively for archival, right? Because as artists, we put a lot of work and effort into what we do. And a lot of the games that we make can go off and end up being cultural touchstones for our industry. So I think we really owe it to ourselves to work in this really good color management system to kind of protect our stories' futures, so future generations can enjoy the same games that we made today, but on better hardware in the future. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much for listening.